Hey everybody, Juan Samudio here, and this is the first video of the Mechanisms of Hypertrophy series, and we're going to start with the basics today. We're going to talk about how do muscles grow. So what we're going to go over today in this video is the structure of the skeletal muscle, the muscle growth and gains, how muscle growth occurs. Then we're going to go into the different types of muscle growth, or how muscle can grow, which is radial growth and longitudinal growth. And then we're going to finish off with a quick conclusion. So, first things first, we must understand the structure of the skeletal muscle. Therefore, it'll be a lot easier to understand anything that comes after, not only in the series, but of the topic of anatomy, biomechanics, or just hypertrophy in general. So, the tendon, we're going to start from the ground up, or from bigger to smaller. We're going to start from the tendon, and all the tendon does is it's the part that attaches the muscle to the bone. Then we're going to move down to the fascicle. The fascicle is just fiber bundles, and fiber bundles are muscle fibers plus the extracellular matrix, right? Now the muscle fibers are also known as a muscle cell or myofiber, and not all of them run across the entire muscle. And we're going to get into that a little bit later. Now below the muscle fiber, or smaller than the muscle fiber, are the myofibrils. And these are bundles of proteins connected to each other. And finally, below myofibrils, we have the myofilaments. And these are force-generating proteins inside the muscle, like actin and myosin. And what's, I think, incredible with these molecules or myofilaments is that they generate piconewtons of force and they travel nanometers, but yet in humans we can produce great amount of force and great excursions because of their incredible arrangements. Now, muscle growth and gains. Well, the majority of muscle growth comes from the building of these new myofilaments, right? Proteins that generate force within the myofibril, right? Because we're gonna talk about proteins that can also grow, but surrounding the myofibril. But the majority of the growth is coming from the proteins that are growing inside the myofibril, right? And this new addition of proteins that generate force will make you stronger, right? Pretty critical thinking right there, right? Just common sense. And because of this, there is a relationship between size and strength, but that relationship is not perfect due to other elements and fluid. Now, the first type of growth is radial growth, which is basically muscle width, right? How thick the muscle is. Well, radial growth is the proportional increase between the contractile and non-contractile components of the muscle cell. The contractile ones are the ones that generate force, non-contractile are the ones that don't generate force. So what's the difference? Well, the force-generating elements or components are the myofilaments in the myofibrils, right? The actin and myosin, for example. Now, the non-force generating elements are the ones that surround the myofibril. They're the ones that are not inside. And these can be things like mitochondria, sarcoplasmic reticulum, the cytoskeletal proteins, connective tissue, and the intracellular fluid. Now, this concept of sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, or this theory of sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, basically means the growth from the non-contractile elements. So the growth of all these different components that don't generate force. Now, while that can happen, again, the majority of growth comes from the force-generating components because those are the ones that make up the majority of the muscle cell. They make up, I believe, roughly 80%. Next up, we have longitudinal growth. Now, this occurs when proteins are added at the end of myofibers, or muscle fibers, sorry. And what's interestingly enough is that the location of the highest adaptive capacity due to extremely high mitochondrial and protein synthetic activity is the end of those muscle fibers, right? The muscle tendon junction. And what's interestingly is that we've only seen this addition of proteins in longitudinal growth grow at the end of the myofibers, right? So, and again, that is the location with the highest adaptive capacity. due to the extremely high mitochondrial and protein synthetic activity. And then we know that mitochondria is the muscle powerhouse of the cell, right? Anyway, sarcomeres, right? The contractile units of the muscle, right? Contractile protein groups are added or increased at the end of the myofibrils, right? The muscle tendon junction. And this occurs when a muscle is chronically stretched or constantly stretched, right? So when we're doing an exercise or you're stretching, right, you really want to make sure you're stretching that muscle. This can theoretically add sarcomeres, what's known as in series, right, or serial sarcomere numbers. Basically, sarcomeres or these contractile protein groups are being added on the same axis like chains, right? Because your muscle has sarcomeres arranged in series and parallel. So series are the chain sarcomeres, the ones that are added on the same axis, and then parallel are the sarcomeres that are added stacking on top of each other, right? Now, which is kind of weird because you're like, well, how can muscle fibers get longer? Or how can we add contractile protein groups on the same axis? Wouldn't that just make the muscle longer? Well, not all muscle fibers run across the entire muscle, and this is known as intrafascicular termination, right? Because muscle fibers can end some points between the middle of the muscle, longitudinal growth can add more proteins within the muscle belly, potentially increasing the girth of the entire muscle or of the muscle due to, I believe, increase in the cross-sectional area. Now, I do want to talk about, or I do want to add a little more on this topic of the addition of sarcomeres in series. So, extending this conclusion, others often state confidently that muscles will change the number of sarcomeres in series after a chronic length change, such that optimal sarcomere length is achieved at the most common joint position. But this may be an overstatement, at least as for now. This hypothetical result may turn out not to be true because of things we've seen, right? All muscles do not adapt to the same extent. Immobilization is not necessarily a realistic adaptation model since muscle length and activity are relatively fixed. There is an age-specific effect that is not yet fully understood, and there are no available analogous data for the upper extremity in which large numbers of surgical transpositions are performed. So although this phenomenon is possible, there is almost no data since it is impossible to measure fascicle length accurately, and the data that we do have is very confusing. So I think it's important that you just consider that, and instead of taking things at 100% and say, oh, we grow muscle by adding sarcomeres in series. Well, potentially, possibly, yes, but we're still not fully sure of the entire mechanism. So, the conclusion, growth is the proportional, or growth can be summarized as the proportional increase between the contractile and the non-contractile elements, the ones that generate force and the ones that don't generate force. Then the largest part of muscle growth is expanding the myofibril by adding new myofilaments. So again, the largest part of growth is going to come by the addition of those contractile elements that do generate force by being added inside the myofibril, right? Both radial and longitudinal growth are largely dependent on building new proteins. And how do we build new proteins? Well, the body can build new proteins through a process called protein synthesis. And finally, sarcoplasmic hypertrophy can change muscle size, but does not account for the large portion of the muscle cell volume, so growth potential is limited. So we can build those non-contractile units that surround the myofibril, but they don't take up the majority of the muscle cell. So that was it for this video. Thank you. As always, like, subscribe, follow us on social media, and any questions you have in the comments. Thank you.